My name is Lydia Brennan. I am 41 years old, and on a Tuesday morning in March, I sat inside a courtroom in Charlotte, North Carolina, wearing a gray blazer my father had picked out with me at a department store on the last Christmas we had together, and I watched the man I had been married to for 11 years tell a judge that he was entitled to half of everything I had ever built. Marcus didn't look at me when he said it. He never really looked at me anymore. He sat at the opposing counsel's table in a navy suit he'd bought 6 weeks earlier, right around the time he had stopped coming home before midnight, and he let his attorney, a man named Dean Whitfield, lean forward with both palms flat on the table and say, "Your Honor, Beacon Strategy Group was built during the course of this marriage. Under North Carolina equitable distribution law, it is a marital asset. Mr. Voss is entitled to 50% of its current valuation." The valuation they had submitted, $4.2 million. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I held my pen lightly between two fingers and watched Dean Whitfield straighten his tie. And I thought about my father. About a conversation we'd had in his study on a winter evening when I was 30 years old and newly engaged and glowing with the particular confidence of a woman who believes she has chosen correctly. My father had looked at me across his desk and said, "Lydia, I love Marcus. But I love you more. And I need you to sign something before the wedding." I had laughed, assuming he was joking. He was not joking. What Marcus didn't know, what Dean Whitfield hadn't found, what 11 years of living inside my life had never revealed to him, was that my father had built a wall around my company before I even knew I needed one, quietly, carefully. The way my father did everything. This is that story. My father, Richard Brennan, was born in Asheville, North Carolina, the second of 5 children, to a man who worked in textiles and a woman who kept the books for their church. He put himself through Davidson College on a combination of academic scholarships and summer construction work, then went on to law school at Wake Forest University. He spent 30 years building a small but deeply respected estate planning practice in Charlotte. Not glamorous, not flashy, but solid. The kind of work that doesn't get celebrated at cocktail parties, but that people remember in the worst moments of their lives, when the person they loved is gone, and they are standing in a lawyer's office trying to understand what comes next. My father was the person who helped them understand. He was patient in a way that felt almost architectural. He built things to last. He was 58 years old when I launched Beacon Strategy Group. I was 29. I had spent the previous 5 years working for a mid-size consulting firm in uptown Charlotte, climbing slowly and watching men with significantly less experience get promoted faster. And I had made a decision the way I make most important decisions in my life, quietly, over a long period of time, after I was completely certain. I quit on a Friday in late September. I registered the LLC on the following Monday. I used $34,000 in personal savings and a corner of my parents' dining room table as my first office. My mother, Carol Brennan, now 63, was a retired high school English teacher who greeted every new development in my life with a combination of genuine pride and persistent low-level anxiety. She brought me coffee at the dining room table and asked every 3 days whether I had enough clients yet. My father, by contrast, said nothing about the business for the first 6 months. He simply started showing up with groceries when he sensed I hadn't eaten, and reading contracts when I slid them across the table with that particular look I had inherited directly from him. He never once said the words, "I believe in you." He just behaved as though there was never any question at all. Beacon Strategy Group became, over the following 12 years, a brand consulting firm with 14 full-time employees, offices in 2 cities, and a client list that included regional hospital networks, mid-sized technology companies, and 3 firms that had appeared on Charlotte Business Journal's Fast 50 list 2 years running. By the time I was sitting in that courtroom, Beacon had revenues of just under $3 million annually and a reputation I had built. Contact by contact, proposal by proposal, late night by late night. Every dollar in that company carried my fingerprints. There was not a single contract, not a single client relationship, not a single line of growth that had not begun with something I had started. Marcus Voss came into my life when I was 28, 1 year before I launched Beacon. We met at a fundraiser for a children's hospital in uptown Charlotte on a Thursday evening in November. He was 31, tall, polished, the kind of man who commands a room without appearing to try. He worked in commercial real estate development, which in Charlotte in those years was an exceptionally good business to be in. He had a quick laugh and an easy confidence, and he asked smart questions. On our second date, at a small restaurant in Plaza Midwood, he looked across the table at me and said, "What do you actually want to build with your life? Not what do you do. What do you want to build?" I thought I was in love with him before dessert arrived. We dated for 2 years. We got engaged in the fall. My father met Marcus and me for dinner on East Boulevard to celebrate. He hugged Marcus warmly. He paid for dinner. And 3 weeks later, he called me into his study and sat me down across his desk in the chair he reserved for clients, which was the only signal I needed that what was coming was serious. He said, "Lydia, you know I like Marcus." I said, "Yes, Daddy, I know." He said, "But I'm going to need you to look at something your grandfather's estate attorney and I put together a while back. It has to do with how certain business assets are classified once you're married. It's a protection." He slid a manila folder across the desk toward me. I remember thinking he was being overly cautious. I remember thinking Marcus would never be that kind of person. I was 30 years old and I believed, with the complete certainty available only to people who have not yet been tested, that love was sufficient armor against most things. But I also knew who my father was. I had watched him for 3 decades helping families navigate the wreckage that comes from insufficient planning, from documents not signed, from assumptions not written down. I trusted him the way you trust the person who has never once steered you wrong in your entire life. So I read the folder carefully. I asked my questions. And 10 days before my wedding, I signed the document my father placed in front of me. I tucked the knowledge away and did not think about it again for 9 years. The marriage was good in the beginning, and I mean that sincerely. The first 5 years were genuinely good. We bought a house in Dilworth. We traveled to Portugal, to Oaxaca, and once to Iceland in October, when the northern lights were so relentless and extraordinary that Marcus grabbed my hand without a word and held it for a long time. He was proud of Beacon in those years, or he performed pride convincingly enough that it held up to close inspection. He talked about my company at dinner parties with what sounded like admiration. He framed our first major client contract and hung it in the hallway of our home. He told his mother, Elaine Voss, a formidable woman from Raleigh who collected opinions the way other people collect fine art, that he had married the smartest woman he had ever met. Then Beacon started growing faster than his business could keep pace with. I don't think Marcus made a conscious decision to resent me. I think it happened the way water damages a foundation, slowly, invisibly, until one day there are cracks that cannot be explained by anything other than time and pressure. By our 6th year, the comments had started. Small ones, precisely calibrated to sound like observations when they were actually corrections. "You're always working. You care more about your clients than our marriage. You've changed." That last one arrived at dinner on a Thursday in our 7th year, delivered low and even. After I had canceled plans because a client in a funding crisis had called at 5:45 in the evening, I looked at him across the table. I put my fork down. I said, "I'm sorry." He said nothing. We went to bed in the deliberate silence that had begun to feel like the third person living in our house. There was an evening in our 8th year when we were at a dinner party at a mutual friend's home, and one of the husbands there made an offhand comment about a local businesswoman who had just sold her company for a significant sum. He said, "I always get nervous around women who are better at business than their husbands." He laughed when he said it. Marcus laughed too. And I watched that laugh arrive a half-second too quickly and stay a half-second too long. And I filed the observation away in the place where I keep things I am not yet ready to name. By our 9th year, the silence between us had weight. Marcus had started taking weekend trips alone. Business, he said, though the pattern of those trips never quite mapped to his actual project calendar. He was cordial and present in the way people are when they are already somewhere else entirely in their minds. I was watching. I was taking note. I simply hadn't decided what to do with what I was accumulating. The breaking point came on a Sunday evening in October. The exact date was the 14th. I know because it was my parents' 38th wedding anniversary, and I had spent the afternoon at their house in Myers Park for dinner and come home calm and full, with a container of my mother's leftover pot roast in my hand. I walked in the front door at 7:15 in the evening. The kitchen light was on. Marcus was sitting at the island with a glass of bourbon and a document spread out in front of him that I recognized immediately as the internal financial summary of Beacon Strategy Group. Our internal document, numbers, projections, the property lease, employee payroll structure. I stood in the doorway. He looked up. He didn't look guilty. That was the thing that landed hardest. He looked prepared. He said, "We need to talk." I said, "All right." He picked up the financial summary, held it up slightly and said, "I met with an attorney last week, a divorce attorney. I want to separate, and before we get into all of that, I want you to understand something. I've already had Beacon valued. Dean says we have a strong case for equitable distribution. I'm going to get half." He said it calmly. He said it the way you tell someone what the weather will be tomorrow. Not a threat, not a question. A statement of settled fact. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there in the doorway of my own kitchen with my coat still on, and I thought about my father. About the folder on the desk. About the document I had signed 10 days before my wedding while believing, completely and sincerely, that I would never need it. I thought, Marcus has never once asked what my father actually put in place for this business. I said, "Okay. I need a minute." He nodded, satisfied, and turned back to his bourbon. I went upstairs to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed in my coat, and I dialed my father's longtime estate planning partner, a man named Gerald Harmon, who had been my father's closest colleague for 22 years, and who was, I knew, the custodian of everything my father had set in motion before his death the previous spring. Gerald picked up after 2 rings. I said, "Gerald, I need to find the Brennan Trust document. The one with the business provisions." He was quiet for exactly 1 moment. Then he said, "Lydia, I've been wondering when you'd call. I did not sleep that night. Not out of grief or panic, but out of a focused clarity I had not felt in months. There is a particular quality of alertness that comes when you realize the ground you are standing on is considerably more solid than the person threatening you understands." I lay still in the dark and I thought through everything carefully. The way my father had taught me to read a problem from the outside before you touched a single piece of it. Gerald arrived at my office at 9 o'clock the following morning. He was 67 years old, silver-haired. With the deliberate composure of a man who had spent 4 decades in rooms full of grief and crisis, and had never once allowed the atmosphere to alter his judgment, he set a slim leather portfolio on my desk and opened it. Inside was a document, 14 pages. The Brennan Family Trust, established at the time of my birth, amended and restated with a business protection addendum in February 11 years prior, 2 months before my wedding date. Gerald walked me through it section by section. My grandfather had originally established the trust as an asset protection vehicle. When my father inherited the estate, he restructured it, and when I became engaged, he had added a provision that he had apparently spent considerable time designing with care. The provision stated in plain and unambiguous language that any business entity in which Lydia Ann Brennan held a controlling interest and which had been established prior to marriage was to be considered a separate property trust asset, held in the name of the Brennan Family Trust, rather than the marital estate, regardless of whether marital funds or effort had contributed to its growth during the marriage. And then the critical clause, the one my father had argued for specifically according to Gerald's contemporaneous notes from that meeting. Any claim against the trust-held business interest would require the claimant to demonstrate, by clear and convincing evidence, that the trust had been established fraudulently or had been used as a vehicle for dissipating marital assets, neither of which Marcus could demonstrate. Because neither was true. Gerald looked at me when he finished. He said, "Your father was thorough, Lydia. The document was notarized by 3 witnesses. Your signature is on file. The disclosure was documented. This is airtight." I sat back in my chair. I said, "Does Marcus know this exists?" Gerald's expression did not shift. He said that would depend entirely on whether Marcus ever asked the right question. Marcus had never asked. Not once. Not in 11 years. I retained Patricia O.C. that same week. Patricia was 44. A former litigator who had spent 15 years in family law and had a quiet reputation in the Charlotte legal community for being devastating in courtrooms precisely because she was so unhurried about everything. She wore small pearl earrings and spoke slowly and smiled in a way that made opposing counsel consistently underestimate her until it was too late. She reviewed the trust documents over 2 full days. On Wednesday afternoon at 3 o'clock, she called me and said, "Lydia, this is one of the most elegantly constructed business protection instruments I have reviewed in my entire career. Your father knew exactly what he was doing. We can defend this." I said, "Good." She said, "I want you to understand something first. Once we file and disclose the trust and discovery, Marcus's team will pivot hard. They will claim he contributed meaningfully to Beacon's growth. They may attempt to have the trust invalidated. It will get uncomfortable before it gets clean." I said, "Patricia, I have been sitting through uncomfortable things without reacting my entire adult life." She laughed once, short and dry. She said, "Then we are in very good shape." The weeks between that call and the court date were the quietest stretch of time I had known in years. Marcus had moved to a short-term rental in the South End by then. His attorney, Dean Whitfield, sent Patricia a discovery request covering 4 years of Beacon's financials, contracts, my personal tax returns, and the operating structure of the company in granular detail. Patricia disclosed everything, every document they asked for, and tucked into the 5th disclosure packet in Section 4 of a 41-page financial exhibit, she included, without a word of commentary, a complete copy of the Brennan Family Trust and its business protection addendum. She told me afterward that Dean Whitfield's office called her 40 minutes after receiving that packet. The associate who called said, "We'll need some time to review the trust document." Patricia said, "Of course. Take all the time you need." She used exactly the tone of someone offering a glass of water. They requested a 3-week extension. Patricia granted it graciously. Dean Whitfield's response brief arrived on a Tuesday morning. They argued 3 things: that the trust had not been properly disclosed to Marcus prior to the marriage, constituting fraudulent concealment, that Marcus's sustained support of my professional life constituted an equitable contribution to Beacon's growth, and that the addendum, drafted by a now-retired attorney, may not have met the evidentiary standard for an enforceable premarital business protection. Patricia read me the brief over the phone. When she finished, I said, "How do you want to handle this?" She said, "With pleasure." Patricia's response brief was 47 pages. I read every single word of it. She documented the notarized signature, the 3 witnesses, the independent review of the document structure, Gerald's contemporaneous meeting notes confirming that I had been fully informed of the document's contents and purpose before my wedding, and a signed disclosure form my father had insisted I provide to the notary on the same day I signed. She included my income statements from the 3 years prior to my marriage, demonstrating that Beacon had already been generating revenue before the wedding date, and a chart showing the company's growth trajectory was consistent and attributable to operational effort rather than any particular contribution from Marcus. She included at the very end a single paragraph. It noted that the fraudulent concealment claim was particularly difficult to sustain given that Marcus Voss had been represented by his own legal counsel at the time of the wedding, that his attorney had received the couple's financial disclosures in full, and that the Brennan Family Trust had been listed by name in those disclosures. Whether Marcus had asked his attorney to review it, Patricia noted crisply, was a question for Marcus and his attorney to answer between themselves. I sat with that paragraph for a long time after I read it. He had known a trust existed. He had simply never asked what was in it. In the weeks before the court date, Marcus attempted twice to reach me directly. The first time, he left a voicemail at 11 o'clock at night. His voice was measured but with something underneath it. Not quite panic, but its close cousin. He said, "Lydia, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the trust. I think we should talk before this goes further." I played the message once. Then I forwarded it to Patricia. She told me not to respond. I didn't. The second time, he appeared at the Beacon offices on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:30. My assistant Bree texted me from the front desk, "Marcus is here, asking to see you. He looks nervous." I texted back, "Tell him I'm unavailable. He can contact my attorney." I returned to the client call I was on. I heard him leave 7 minutes later. I know it was 7 minutes because I checked the security panel time log. If you are still with me right now, I want you to pause for a moment and leave a comment below. Tell me what you would have done in that kitchen at 7:15 in the evening, Would you have reacted? And if this story is landing for you, please subscribe to Executive Revenge Stories before we get to what happened in that courtroom. Because what comes next is something I want you to see all the way through. I thought about my father constantly in those weeks before the hearing. He had died the previous spring in April of the cardiac event his doctors had been monitoring for 2 years, and that he had managed with the same quiet practicality he brought to every other matter in his life. He was in his study when it happened. He was at his desk. My mother found him at 8:15 in the morning. He was still wearing his reading glasses. There was a client file open in front of him. He was working until the very end, of course he was. I had not fully grieved him before the divorce proceedings consumed all available space. Grief has a patient way of finding you in the in-between moments. It found me in the evenings, when I was reviewing briefs at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and I would reach for the phone to call him. And then I would remember, and the silence where his voice should have been would settle over the room like something with actual physical weight. He had built this wall without telling me he was building it, because telling me would have meant expressing a doubt he was too gentle to voice directly. Instead, he had simply prepared, and he had trusted me to find it when I needed it. I wondered in those weeks before the hearing whether he had known, in the particular intuitive way he knew things, that this day would come. I will never have the answer to that. What I know is that when I walked into that courtroom in Charlotte on that Tuesday morning in March, I was wearing the gray blazer, and I felt, in the most rational and unsentimental way I am capable of, that he was in the room with me. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected. Mecklenburg County, Family Court Division. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent overhead lighting. Patricia and I arrived at 8:45 in the morning. Dean Whitfield and Marcus arrived 12 minutes later. Marcus was wearing the navy suit. He gave a short nod in my general direction when he entered. I was looking at Patricia, who was arranging documents with the unhurried efficiency of someone who is not worried about a single thing. Judge Constance Halloway was in her late 50s and took the bench at 9 o'clock precisely. She began with the brisk, direct efficiency of someone who had read every brief, had already formed her views, and was not remotely interested in being persuaded of things she had already decided for herself. Dean Whitfield went first. He was polished, thorough, confident. He stood and said, "Your Honor, it is the petitioner's position that the Brennan Family Trust Business Addendum does not meet the threshold for a valid premarital agreement as defined under North Carolina statute, and that even if it did, the respondent's sustained contribution to the marital lifestyle, including consistent support of the business owner's professional endeavors, constitutes an equitable claim against the business valuation." He spoke for 8 minutes. There was not a flicker of hesitation in his delivery. Marcus sat very still during it. His hands were flat on the table. He was watching the judge. Patricia stood. She said, "Your Honor, the Brennan Family Trust Business Addendum was executed 11 years ago, 2 months before the marriage of Lydia Ann Brennan and Marcus Allen Voss. It was signed by Ms. Dunny, Brennan in the presence of 3 notarized witnesses. It was listed by name in the couple's financial disclosures provided to Mr. Calmley, Voss's legal counsel at the time of the marriage." She paused for the length of a breath. Then she said, "Mr. Voss had the opportunity to review this document prior to agreeing to the marriage. His counsel had access to it. Whether he chose to read it is not a failure of disclosure. It is a choice." She placed the trust document on the judge's bench. Judge Halloway picked it up. She did not rush. She turned pages. She had clearly already read it in preparation, but she went back through it with a deliberateness that made the entire room go still. The overhead lights hummed. Someone in the gallery behind us shifted in a seat. Marcus's leg, I noticed from the periphery of my vision, had begun to move, the slight rhythmic pressure of a foot against the floor that means someone is working very hard to appear composed. The judge set the document down. She looked at Dean Whitfield. She said, "Counselor, your brief argues fraudulent concealment. What evidence do you have that the respondent actively concealed this trust from your client?" Dean Whitfield said, "Your Honor, Mr. Voss was not made aware of the specific business protection provisions contained in the addendum." The judge said, "Was the trust's existence disclosed in the financial disclosures provided prior to the marriage?" He said, "The trust was listed by name, yes, but the specific addendum was not discussed with Mr. Voss directly." The judge looked at him steadily for a moment. She said, "Was Mr. Voss represented by legal counsel at the time of the marriage?" He said, "Yes, Your Honor." She said, "And did that counsel receive the financial disclosures?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." "Then I am struggling to understand the basis for a fraudulent concealment claim, counselor." The room was completely silent. She turned back to the trust document, and she read from it, not summarizing. Reading aloud, her voice was clear and even, and the words my father's attorney had drafted 11 years ago, the words my father had reviewed and approved and insisted upon, filled that wood-paneled room. The provision specifying that Beacon Strategy Group, as a business entity established prior to the marriage and held as a trust asset, was not subject to equitable distribution as marital property. The provision requiring clear and convincing evidence of fraud to override the trust classification. The clause my father had argued for specifically. She read it once at a measured pace. Then she read the governing sentence again, slowly. I watched Marcus's face while she read it. I had spent 11 years learning that face. The confident version. The charming version. The cold, deliberate version he wore when he intended to win something. What I saw in that courtroom was the version I had never seen before. The one where the ground had dropped away completely. His jaw was set. His eyes were fixed on the table. He was very still in the particular way people go, still when something is broken and they are deciding how to hold the pieces together in front of witnesses. His mother, Elaine Voss, was in the gallery behind him. She had come up from Raleigh for this proceeding. The woman who had once told her book club that her son had married a woman worth watching. I was aware of her presence without looking at her. I kept my eyes on Judge Holloway. Judge Holloway set the document down for the final time. She said, "It is the finding of this court that the Brennan Family Trust Business Addendum constitutes a valid and enforceable property protection agreement under North Carolina statute. Beacon Strategy Group, as a business entity established prior to the marriage and held as a separate property trust asset, is not subject to equitable distribution as a marital asset. The petitioner's claim to 50% of the business valuation is denied." She looked briefly over her reading glasses. She said, "We'll proceed to the remaining marital assets." And she turned a page in her file and moved forward. She moved on, like it was simply the next item. Which, for her, it was. I felt Patricia's hand rest very briefly on my forearm. She said nothing. She didn't need to. I didn't cry. I didn't cry. I didn't exhale dramatically. I didn't turn around to look at Elaine in the gallery. I sat straight in my chair and I let the fluorescent lights hum, and I thought about my father at his desk on an April morning with his reading glasses on and a client file open in front of him. And I thought, "I found the wall, Daddy." It held. Dean Whitfield filed a motion to reconsider 3 weeks after the hearing. Patricia responded in 11 pages. The motion was denied without a further hearing. That was the end of Marcus's claim against Beacon. The remaining marital assets were divided without drama. The house in Dilworth sold for just over $1.1 million, and we split the equity, retirement accounts, joint savings, the furniture we had chosen together in what felt now like a different chapter of a different life, all divided according to Patricia's careful negotiation. Marcus did not speak to me directly during any of it. He communicated entirely through Dean Whitfield. That was fine. We had said everything that needed to be said on that October evening in the kitchen, though only one of us had known it at the time. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning in May. Patricia called me at 11 o'clock in the morning to tell me. I was in a client meeting. I stepped into the hallway, took the call, said, "Thank you, Patricia." She said, "It was my genuine pleasure, Lydia." I went back into the meeting. Elaine Voss sent me a text message 3 days after the final hearing. I have read it many times since, and I am still not entirely certain what she intended by it. She wrote, "Your father was a smart man, he loved you very much, nothing more." No apology. No commentary on her son or the marriage or what had happened in that courtroom. Just those 2 sentences. I sat with them for a long time. Then I wrote back, "Yes, he did." And I put the phone face down on the table. My mother and I had dinner the week the divorce was finalized, at a restaurant on Providence Road that she and my father had frequented for 30 years. She ordered her usual. I ordered his. We didn't discuss Marcus very much. We talked about Beacon, about a new hire I was genuinely excited about a client in Atlanta who had just extended our contract for another 2 years. At one point, she reached across the table and held my hand for a moment without saying a single word. Then she let go and picked up her fork. That is my mother. She has always known when to hold on and when to let you go. I think about that document often now, the one I signed 10 days before my wedding while believing completely and sincerely that I would never need it. I think about what it means that my father asked me to sign it, and that I trusted him enough to do so without fully understanding what I was protecting myself against. I didn't know then what I know now about the slow mathematics of resentment, about how a marriage can erode not through any single dramatic event, but through the steady accumulation of one person outgrowing the story the other person needed them to remain inside. I think my father knew. Not that Marcus specifically would do this, but that life has a way of requiring you to defend the things you have built, and that love, even genuine love, is not always sufficient protection on its own. He had spent 30 years watching people learn that truth in the worst possible moments. He had decided that his daughter would not learn it unprepared. That is what I want to say to you if you are watching this and you are in the middle of building something. Whether it is a business, a creative practice, a career, a life. The people who love us most sometimes protect us in ways we don't understand until the moment we need the protection most. Pay attention to those moments. When someone who has earned your trust over a lifetime offers you quiet, practical protection, take it. Sign the document. Read the folder. Make the appointment. Not because you believe the worst will happen, but because preparation is an act of self-respect. It is the most dignified thing you can do for the version of yourself who is going to need it someday. And if you are watching this from the other side of this story, if someone has already tried to take something you built, or if someone is right now in a kitchen or a conference room or a courtroom telling you calmly what they intend to claim, I need you to hear this. It is not too late to understand what you own and how you own it. The resources exist. The help is available. Information is the quietest form of power, and it belongs to you. Please find it. I still wear the blazer. The gray one my father and I picked out together on a December afternoon at a department store downtown, the last Christmas we had. The cuffs are slightly worn now. I have no intention of replacing it. Beacon Strategy Group is in its 13th year of operation. We have 16 employees now. We opened a second office in Raleigh last fall. I was in that office on a Tuesday afternoon in November, 3 weeks after we signed the lease, standing at the window looking out at the street below. And I thought about the dining room table where I had started all of this. My mother's coffee cups. My father reading contracts across from me without comment. I thought about everything that had tried to interrupt the building of this thing and had, in every instance, failed. I thought, as I often do, about quiet walls and long plans, and the kind of love that expresses itself as paperwork. I did not feel triumphant. I felt steady, and I have found, over time, that steady outlasts everything. My name is Lydia Brennan. I am 41 years old, and I am the sole owner of everything my father helped me protect. If you are watching this and there is something in your life that belongs to you in the deepest sense of that word, something you built yourself from nothing, what would it take for you to make absolutely certain that no one could ever take it? Leave your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you for sitting with me through this story today. It is one that lives close to me, because at its heart, it is really about two things at once. The quiet, entirely practical love of a parent who thinks 14 steps ahead, and the power of a woman who trusts that love enough to act on it even when she cannot yet see exactly why. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about something you are building or something you have not yet protected, please share it with someone who might need it. And if you would like to see more stories like this one, subscribe to Executive Revenge Stories. We release a new story every single day, and we believe with everything we have that every woman who is underestimated deserves to have her moment witnessed. Thank you for being a witness today. Keep building, keep going, and never apologize for how far you have already come.